17 years after a mysterious shipwreck, small island near Hawaii unveils mystery. As told by Marcus Chen, survivor. My name is Marcus Chen, and 17 years ago I experienced something that still haunts my dreams and challenges everything I thought I knew about human nature, survival, and the thin line between civilization and chaos. What happened on that small, unnamed island, 30 miles southwest of Maui, changed not just my life, but the lives of 11 other people, though only 8 of us made it home to tell the tale. People often ask me why I've decided to speak now, after all these years of silence. The answer is simple. The truth has a way of eating at you from the inside, and I've carried this burden long enough. What happened out there wasn't just a shipwreck. It was a descent into something darker, something that revealed the very worst and, surprisingly, the very best of who we are, when everything we know is stripped away. It was July 15th, 2008, when I boarded the Pacific Dream, a 40-foot charter vessel captained by a weathered man named Captain Tom Rodriguez. I was 28 then, working as a marine biologist for the University of Hawaii, and this was supposed to be a routine research expedition to study coral reef systems around the smaller Hawaiian islands. But like so many things in life, what was supposed to be routine became anything but. The passenger manifest that day read like a cross-section of American life. There was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a marine archaeologist from Stanford who was documenting shipwrecks in the area. James and Linda Morrison, a retired couple from Ohio, celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary with what they called the adventure of a lifetime. Rebecca Torres, a 19-year-old college student from California who was working as a research assistant for the summer. David Kim, a Korean-American photographer for National Geographic who was documenting marine ecosystems. There was also Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest from Honolulu, who had somehow convinced Captain Tom to let him tag along. He said he was writing a book about finding God in nature. The crew consisted of Captain Tom, his first mate Elena Vasquez, a tough-as-nails woman in her 40s who could navigate by the stars, and Jake Thompson, a young deckhand from Oregon who was working his way through college. Finally, there were the Johansson twins, Eric and Lars, 2 Norwegian marine engineers who were consulting on some underwater construction project near Molokai. We left Lahaina Harbor at 6 a.m. under perfect conditions. The Pacific was like glass, the sky was clear, and everyone was in high spirits. Captain Tom had been running charters in these waters for over 20 years, and his confidence was infectious. "Another day in paradise," he kept saying, his leathery hands steady on the wheel. But the Pacific Ocean has a way of humbling even the most experienced sailors. The first sign of trouble came around 2 p.m., when Elena noticed the barometric pressure dropping faster than she'd ever seen. Within minutes, the crystal-clear sky began to darken with clouds that seemed to appear out of nowhere. Captain Tom tried to radio the Coast Guard, but all we got was static, as if something was interfering with our communications. "Never seen anything like this," Tom muttered, his usual confidence wavering for the first time. Weather reports showed clear skies for the next 3 days. The storm hit us like the wrath of God himself. One minute we were cruising through calm waters, and the next we were fighting for our lives against waves that towered 30, maybe 40 feet above us. The Pacific Dream, sturdy as she was no match for the fury that surrounded us. I remember Rebecca screaming as a massive wave crashed over the bow, and Father Santos trying to comfort the Morrisons, who were clutching each other in the main cabin. The Norwegian twins were helping Jake secure anything that wasn't nailed down, while Dr. Mitchell was frantically trying to save her research equipment. Then came the sound that still gives me nightmares, the grinding, splintering crack of the hull hitting something hard underwater. Later, we would discover it was an uncharted coral reef, one that shouldn't have existed according to any maritime map. But in that moment, all we knew was that we were taking on water fast, and the Pacific Dream was going down. Captain Tom's training kicked in immediately. "Everyone into life jackets. Elena, get the emergency beacon activated. Jake, help me with the life rafts." But the sea had other plans. Another massive wave slammed into us just as we were deploying the first life raft, and that's when everything went to hell. I remember flying through the air, the taste of salt water filling my lungs, and the terrifying silence that follows when you're pulled underwater by a current stronger than anything you've ever imagined. When I finally surfaced, gasping and choking, the Pacific Dream was already half submerged, and my fellow passengers were scattered across the churning waters like broken dolls. I grabbed onto a piece of debris, part of the boat's cabin roof, and started swimming toward other survivors. That's how I found Rebecca first, barely conscious and bleeding from a gash on her forehead. Then David Kim, who was holding onto a waterproof camera case like his life depended on it. One by one, we managed to locate the others. Dr. Mitchell, the Morrison couple, Father Santos, Elena, Jake, and both Johansson twins. The only person we couldn't find was Captain Tom. Elena later told us she saw him go down with the ship, trying to send out one last distress signal. Whether he succeeded or not, we never knew. What we did know was that we were now 12 people, stranded in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no boat, limited supplies, and a storm that seemed determined to kill us all. We stayed together as best we could, using debris from the wreck to create a makeshift flotilla. Elena, being the most experienced sailor among us, took charge naturally. "There's an island about 6 miles southwest of here," she shouted over the wind. "If we can make it there, we might have a chance." 6 miles doesn't sound like much, but when you're swimming in 20-foot swells while trying to keep 12 people together, it might as well be 1,000. We lost most of our supplies in those first few hours, including the emergency beacon that could have saved us all. But somehow, through a combination of luck, determination, and what Father Santos insisted was divine intervention, we made it. Just as the sun was setting on what should have been our last day alive, Eric Johansson spotted the dark outline of land ahead. The island was small, maybe 2 miles long and half a mile wide, and completely uninhabited. It wasn't on any of our charts, which should have been our first clue that something wasn't right about this place. But when you're half-drowned and exhausted, you don't ask questions about your salvation. You just thank God you're alive. We dragged ourselves onto a narrow beach of black volcanic sand, and that first night we huddled together under a makeshift shelter Elena had constructed from palm fronds. Everyone was in shock, but we were alive. At that point, we still believed rescue was just a matter of time. We were wrong. The first few days were almost manageable. We had some basic survival skills among us. Elena knew how to build proper shelters and start fires. The Johansson twins were excellent at improvising tools and fishing equipment, and Father Santos, surprisingly, turned out to be quite good at finding edible plants. Dr. Mitchell's archaeological background helped her identify safe sources of fresh water, while David documented everything with his miraculously waterproof camera. But as days turned into a week, and then 2 weeks, the psychological pressure began to mount. Our rescue beacon was at the bottom of the ocean. No planes passed overhead. The island seemed to exist in some kind of dead zone where the outside world simply couldn't find us. That's when the argument started. It began with small disagreements about rationing food and water. Jake wanted to explore more of the island, to look for better resources, while Elena insisted we should stay near the beach where rescue planes could spot us. The Morrison couple, both in their 60s, were struggling with the physical demands of island life, and some of the younger survivors started viewing them as a burden. But the real tensions emerged when we realized we weren't alone on the island. On our 15th day, Lars Johansson found evidence of previous human habitation. Old fire pits, carved symbols on trees, and what looked like grave markers made from stacked stones. Dr. Mitchell's archaeological eye identified some of the carvings as being at least 50 years old, possibly older. "Someone else was stranded here before us," she announced during our evening gathering. maybe multiple groups over many years. That night, Rebecca swore she heard voices coming from the interior of the island, voices speaking in a language she couldn't identify. David claimed he saw lights moving through the jungle, lights that had no natural explanation. Father Santos insisted these were just hallucinations brought on by stress and malnutrition, but the rest of us weren't so sure. Elena organized watch schedules, and we started sleeping in shifts. Everyone was on edge, jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond our fire. Then, on the 21st day, Jake disappeared. We woke up that morning to find his sleeping area empty, his few possessions scattered around as if he'd left in a hurry. Elena organized search parties, and we spent the entire day combing the island, calling his name until our voices were hoarse. We found no trace of him, no footprints leading away from camp, no signs of struggle, nothing. That's when the paranoia really set in. David was the first to voice what we were all thinking. What if he didn't just wander off? What if something took him? The question hung in the air like smoke from our dying fire. Rebecca started crying, saying she wanted to go home, that she'd rather die trying to swim to the mainland than stay on this cursed island. The Morrisons huddled together, whispering prayers that sounded more like incantations. But Eric Johansson, the more practical of the twins, had a different theory. What if he didn't disappear at all? What if he's hiding somewhere on the island, watching us? The implications of that possibility were almost worse than supernatural explanations. Why would Jake be hiding from us? What did he know that we didn't? Elena tried to maintain order, but she was fighting a losing battle. Fear had taken root in our little community, and it was spreading like a cancer. We started hoarding food, sleeping with makeshift weapons nearby, and viewing each other with suspicion rather than solidarity. The breaking point came on the 28th day, when we found Jake's body. Dr. Mitchell discovered him in a shallow cave about half a mile inland, and the sight of him will haunt me until the day I die. He hadn't been killed by wild animals or fallen from a cliff. His injuries were too precise, too deliberate. Someone had murdered Jake Thompson, and that someone was almost certainly one of us. The accusation game started immediately. Eric pointed out that Lars had been acting strangely since we found the grave markers. Lars countered by suggesting that Eleanor's military background made her the most likely candidate for violence. Father Santos tried to mediate, insisting that we needed to maintain our humanity in the face of crisis, but even his faith seemed shaken. David, meanwhile, had been documenting everything with his camera, including our increasing paranoia and deteriorating mental states. When Rebecca discovered this, she flew into a rage, accusing him of treating our suffering like some kind of National Geographic special. "You're just waiting for us to kill each other so you can have a story to tell when you get rescued," she screamed at him. The confrontation nearly turned violent. The Morrison couple tried to intervene, but James Morrison collapsed from the stress, clutching his chest. For a terrifying moment, we thought we were about to lose another member of our group. But he recovered after Elena administered some basic first aid. That night, we held what can only be described as a trial. Elena, despite her own suspicions about the others, managed to convince everyone that we needed to work together to identify Jake's killer before panic completely destroyed our chances of survival. We went through everyone's alibis for the night Jake disappeared, examined the crime scene as best we could, and tried to piece together a timeline of events. Dr. Mitchell's archaeological skills proved invaluable in analyzing the evidence, while Father Santos served as a kind of informal judge, ensuring everyone had a chance to speak. What we discovered was both shocking and, in hindsight, predictable. Jake hadn't been killed by one person acting alone. The evidence suggested that at least 3 people had been involved in his death, working together to silence him permanently. But why? What had Jake known or done that made him a threat to multiple members of our group? The answer came from an unexpected source, David's camera. While reviewing footage he'd taken over our weeks on the island, we discovered something that changed everything. Jake had been stealing food from our communal supplies, but more importantly, he had been hoarding water, the one resource we absolutely couldn't spare. His private cache, hidden in the cave where we found his body, contained enough fresh water to keep one person alive for weeks. The revelation hit our group like a physical blow. Jake hadn't just been selfish, he had been actively endangering all of our lives. In the twisted logic of survival, his murder began to make a sick kind of sense. But knowing the motive didn't answer the fundamental question: who had actually killed him? Elena took charge of the investigation, questioning each of us separately like a military interrogator. Her conclusion, delivered 3 days later, was both definitive and devastating. The killers were Lars Johansson, Rebecca Torres, and, most shocking of all, Dr. Sarah Mitchell. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Lars had the engineering knowledge to make Jake's death look accidental at first glance. Rebecca had discovered Jake's water cache during one of her frequent anxiety walks around the island, and Dr. Mitchell had the medical knowledge to ensure he died quickly and quietly. Their plan had been simple: confront Jake about the theft, demand he share his water supply with the group, and when he refused, eliminate the threat he posed to everyone's survival. They claimed they had only intended to frighten him, but Jake had fought back, and things had escalated beyond their control. The confession session that followed was one of the most emotionally devastating experiences of my life. Rebecca sobbed as she described hitting Jake with a rock when he tried to run. Lars methodically explained how they had moved the body to the cave to buy time before its discovery. Dr. Mitchell, the woman we had all looked up to as a leader and voice of reason, calmly detailed how she had checked to make sure Jake was dead before they left the cave. What made it even worse was that on some level, we all understood their actions. Jake's hoarding had put everyone's lives at risk. In the harsh mathematics of survival, his death had actually improved our chances of making it off the island alive. But understanding and forgiving are two very different things. Elena proposed banishing the 3 killers to another part of the island, effectively creating 2 separate camps. Father Santos argued for forgiveness and reintegration, insisting that we needed to stick together. The Morrison couple, traumatized by everything they had witnessed, just wanted to forget the whole thing ever happened. David and I found ourselves in the middle, trying to figure out how to survive, not just physically but morally. How do you live alongside people who have committed murder, even if you understand their reasons? The debate went on for days, growing more heated as our supplies continued to dwindle. Eric Johansson, devastated by his twin brother's involvement in the killing, threatened to leave the group entirely and try to survive on his own. Rebecca had what appeared to be a complete mental breakdown, alternating between hysterical guilt and defiant justification of her actions. Finally, on the 37th day of our ordeal, the decision was made for us. A fishing boat appeared on the horizon. Elena spotted it first during her morning watch, and within minutes we were all on the beach, screaming and waving anything we could find to attract attention. The boat changed course toward our island, and for the first time in over a month, we dared to hope that our nightmare was finally ending. The vessel that rescued us was the Hoku Nui, a commercial fishing boat out of Honolulu, captained by a native Hawaiian man named Keone Nakamura. He later told reporters that he had been following a school of tuna when his sonar picked up what looked like SOS signals from our island, though none of us remembered sending any signals that day. The rescue itself was chaotic. Captain Nakamura and his crew were expecting to find maybe 1 or 2 stranded fishermen, not 12 survivors of a major shipwreck. There wasn't enough room on the boat for everyone, and we had to make 2 trips to get everyone safely back to Maui. I was on the first boat, along with the Morrison couple, Father Santos, Elena, and, ironically, Dr. Mitchell. The others had to wait another 6 hours on the island for the second trip, and I often wonder what they talked about during those final hours, whether they made any kind of peace with what had happened. The media attention that followed was intense, but mercifully brief. The story of 12 people surviving a mysterious shipwreck captured public imagination for a few weeks, but without any dramatic rescue footage or celebrity survivors, it quickly faded from the headlines. Most news reports focused on our survival skills and the mysterious storm that had caused the wreck in the first place. The murder of Jake Thompson was never reported to the authorities. This might seem shocking, but you have to understand the impossible position we all found ourselves in. Jake was already dead. Prosecuting his killers wouldn't bring him back. Lars, Rebecca, and Dr. Mitchell would almost certainly have been convicted of murder or manslaughter, ruining their lives and devastating their families. And all of us had been complicit in the cover-up by choosing not to report the crime immediately. Elena made the decision for all of us during our brief debriefing with the Coast Guard. When asked about casualties, she simply said that Jake Thompson had been swept overboard during the initial storm and that we had been unable to recover his body. The other survivors backed up her story without question. The official record shows that 11 people were rescued from an unnamed island southwest of Maui on August 21, 2008, following the wreck of the charter vessel Pacific Dream. Captain Thomas Rodriguez and deckhand Jake Thompson were listed as lost at sea, presumed drowned. But that's not the whole story, and it's never been the whole story. The psychological aftermath of our ordeal lasted far longer than the physical recovery. Most of us went through months of therapy, trying to process not just the trauma of the shipwreck and survival experience, but the moral complexity of what had happened to Jake. Father Santos left the priesthood within a year of our rescue, saying he could no longer counsel others about forgiveness when he hadn't figured out how to forgive himself for remaining silent about murder. The Morrison couple divorced after 42 years of marriage. Linda later told me that James had developed severe PTSD and couldn't stand to be touched by anyone who had been on the island. Erik Johansson moved back to Norway immediately after our rescue and cut all contact with his twin brother. Lars, from what I've heard, struggled with alcoholism for years before finally getting clean and becoming an advocate for mental health awareness in survival situations. Rebecca Torres spent 2 years in intensive therapy before returning to college, where she eventually earned a degree in social work with a focus on trauma counseling. She sent me a letter a few years ago saying that helping other people deal with their worst moments had been the only way she could live with her own. Dr. Mitchell's career was effectively over, though the public never knew why. She couldn't return to fieldwork without being haunted by memories of the island, and her research suffered accordingly. She eventually took early retirement and moved to a small town in Montana, where she works at a local museum, and according to mutual acquaintances, has never spoken publicly about our experience. David Kim had perhaps the most complex reaction to our ordeal. His photographs from the island, including documentation of our psychological deterioration and the aftermath of Jake's murder, were never published. He destroyed all of them shortly after our rescue, saying he couldn't bear to profit from anyone's suffering. He now works as a wedding photographer in San Diego and has never returned to documentary work. Elena Vasquez was the only one who seemed to emerge from our experience with her fundamental character intact. She continues to work as a maritime navigator and has been involved in several successful rescue operations over the past 17 years. She credits her time on the island with teaching her the true value of clear leadership in crisis situations. As for me, I completed my PhD in marine biology, but never returned to field research. I now teach at a small college in Oregon, and I've spent the past decade and a half trying to understand not just what happened to us on that island, but what it reveals about human nature under extreme pressure. The question that haunts me most isn't whether Jake's killers were justified in their actions. In the harsh logic of survival, they probably were. The question is whether the rest of us were justified in covering up his murder, in choosing group cohesion over justice, in deciding that some truths are too dangerous to tell. I've thought about going public with this story countless times over the years. What stopped me was always the same concern. What would be served by destroying the lives of people who had already suffered enough? Jake Thompson was dead, and no amount of belated justice would change that fact. But recently, something changed my mind. Last month, I received a call from a reporter who had been investigating unsolved disappearances in the Hawaiian Islands. Somehow she had uncovered inconsistencies in our rescue story and was asking uncomfortable questions about Jake's death. Her investigation hadn't advanced far enough to threaten anyone yet, but it was clear that our 17-year-old secret was in danger of being exposed in the worst possible way. That's when I realized that the story needed to be told, but it needed to be told right, with context, with understanding of the impossible choices we faced, and with respect for everyone involved, including Jake. So here it is, the complete, unvarnished truth about what happened on that unnamed island southwest of Maui in the summer of 2008. Jake Thompson was murdered by 3 of his fellow survivors, and the rest of us chose to cover up that crime rather than destroy more lives in pursuit of justice. Were we right to do so? I honestly don't know. I'm not sure anyone could know without having lived through what we experienced. What I do know is that extreme circumstances reveal truths about human nature that we usually prefer to ignore. We are capable of both tremendous cruelty and surprising compassion, often in the same moment. We can make decisions that seem perfectly logical in one context and completely immoral in another. The island changed all of us, but it didn't make us into different people. It just revealed who we really were when everything else was stripped away. Some of us were heroes, some were villains, and most of us were just ordinary people trying to survive an impossible situation with whatever moral compass we still possessed. I often wonder what would have happened if we had never been rescued, if we had been forced to live with the consequences of our choices for months or years instead of just weeks. Would our little society have collapsed into violence and chaos? Or would we have found a way to build something sustainable and decent? Would the killers have been ostracized or eventually forgiven? Would Jake's death have been the first of many or the last? These are questions that can never be answered, but they're worth asking. Because the truth is, we're all just a few bad days away from being tested in ways we never imagined. The veneer of civilization is thinner than most people realize, and when it's stripped away, what's left is raw human nature in all its complexity. I'm telling this story now, not to seek absolution or assign blame, but to bear witness to what happened on that small, unnamed island 17 years ago. Jake Thompson deserved better than to be forgotten, and his killers deserve better than to live their entire lives haunted by a secret that was eating them alive from the inside. Most of all, though, I'm telling this story because I think it has something important to say about forgiveness, survival, and the terrible, beautiful complexity of human nature when everything else falls away. The island is still out there, 30 miles southwest of Maui, still unnamed on most maritime charts. Sometimes I wonder if other people have been stranded there since our rescue, and if so, how their story ended. I hope they found more grace than we did, more wisdom, more humanity in the face of impossible choices. But mostly, I just hope they found their way home. Marcus Chen currently teaches marine biology at Pacific Coast University in Oregon. He never returned to field research and asks that his exact location remain confidential. This report represents his first public statement on the events of July-August 2008. Jake Thompson's remains have never been recovered from the unnamed island southwest of Maui. If you have information about other cases of missing persons in the Hawaiian Islands, please contact the Hawaii Missing Persons Clearinghouse at the phone number on the screen. Every missing person deserves to be found, and every family deserves answers.